Welcome everyone to this edition of JLF 2019. My name is Mridula Nath Chakraborty and I've come from Melbourne, from Monash University, and I'd like to also start the afternoon by respectfully acknowledging and paying my respects to the Kaurna people as a traditional custodian of the lands and waters of the Adelaide region. We pay respects to both elders past and present of the first peoples of this unceded Aboriginal land. We also acknowledge and respect the Kaurna people's cultural, spiritual, physical, and emotional connection with the land, waters, and community. So I'm very excited to be in conversation with two absolutely wonderful colleagues, people who work in the same area as I do, session called Writing Immigrants, Writing the City in Adelaide. On my right, we have Roanna Gonsalves, whose book, The Permanent Resident, was published in India as Sunita D'Souza Goes to Sydney. It won the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards Multicultural Prize in 2018 and was longlisted for the Dobby Literary Award. Her 4-part radio series, and I absolutely urge every one of you who's here to tune into it, On the Tip of a Billion Tongues, which was on ABC Radio National Earshot, to have a sense of the kind of diversity and languages and literatures in India at the moment. It's an absolutely stunning body of work that Roanna has created. It's a portrayal of contemporary India through its multilingual writers. Gonsalves is also a recipient of the Prime Minister's Australia Asia Endeavour Award and extremely active in the sphere of communities of writers, where she provides her support in various kinds of ways. So I highly recommend you pick up a copy of The Permanent Resident to have a sense of the kind of writing Roanna does. On the right is Shameem Black, who is a fellow in Gender, Media and Culture Studies at the Australian National University. Dr. Black teaches in the School of Culture, History, Language, and serves as a Deputy Director of the South Asia Research Institute. Her current work concerns the imaginative life of yoga in a globalized world. And I've long been a fan of the SARI initiative at ANU and known about you, but this is the first time that we're meeting, so I'm really excited to hear what you have to say, Shameem. So let's get started right off with some definitional parameters. Who or what do you think an immigrant is? And how do you understand the word writing? Personally, socially, philosophically? And what is the connection between immigrants and writing? How do you understand this word writing here as a verb as well as an adjective? That is, writing immigrants, that is writing about them or on them, or immigrants who are writing. And how do you understand this category that is constructed or imagined as an immigrant? Shameem, maybe we'll start with you.
Is this picking up a bit? Okay.
Yes.
Well, in some ways, I think one of the things that I think is fascinating about the category of an immigrant is that it has built into it a certain kind of destination. And I think it's actually a question that I'm not sure that one can answer, without, in some sense, looking back in time. Simply, just from personal experience, I grew up in the U.S. I've moved to Australia. I'm about to celebrate 10 years of living here. Am I an immigrant to this country? I don't know. I mean, will I spend the rest of my life here? Will I move to somewhere else? I don't. It's actually a very the kind of question that I think in some ways implies that we know how our lives are going to turn out, that we know what is going to happen, that we know where our place is. And I think for many people, it's a much more fluid experience from that that's filled with provisions and filled with uncertainties and all sorts of different kinds of potential trajectories. So in some sense, we can look at certain communities and say, in retrospect, those were immigrant communities, but did they think of themselves or know themselves as that way at the time? That might have been a different answer. So that's one way that I think about this category. And in terms of writing, I think in some ways, writing is very much a part of placemaking or of trying to answer those questions for many people. Are they immigrants? Are they some other kind of migrant? What exactly? Who are they? What relationship do they have to the world in which they live? And I think writing is the place that brings those questions very much to the fore.
Roanna?
I completely agree, but I also want to add that the term immigrant is more universal than particular. I think we're all immigrants. It's just that we've come here at different points in time. And it's just that when when people who are from the dominant culture in any country, so the Brahmins in India, white people in Australia, when they write fiction, non-fiction, it's masked as neutral. It's masked as the norm. So, it's kind of taken as something that is writing about what is universal in Australia. If a white man writes about their particular culture or ethnic group. But when non-white people write about their particular culture or ethnic group or any other culture, it's seen as immigrant writing, or that it's not a four-letter word, but it could be that the M word, the migrant or the multicultural writing. It's just that Tim Winton writes about white people, and I love his work, but that is a form of immigrant writing as well, about a particular ethnicity and a particular ethnic group. My book, The Permanent Resident, is about immigrants, but particular kinds of immigrants, Indian women of Goan Catholic background from Mumbai who live in Sydney. But it is marked as particular to that particular group of people when white people who write about, young white surfy characters on the northern beaches of Sydney or wherever, that's masked as neutral and the norm, and we all need to be like them to be taken seriously as writers. So for me, that term it suggests that being an immigrant is actually masked as one particular kind of person in Australia, and if you are from the dominant culture, then you're not an immigrant, and it actually masks your own trajectories, your very rich trajectories of coming into this country and contributing to it, or contributing to the dispossession of indigenous people as well. So it's quite a problematic term, but it is problematic, and yet it's one that I embrace as well. So,
actually, both of those responses lead to my second question. Immigration at a previous time was linked to the availability of land and open spaces where all these, that could accommodate all these hordes of immigrants apparently who were dying to come in. But the scenario in the 21st century is very different. And different kinds of trajectory. Shameem, you talk about being provisional. Roanna, you talk about Goan women from Bombay who now live in Sydney. There are specificities to these stories. So what do you think is the connection between immigration and the city in the context that you're most familiar with, each one of you? Roanna, if we start with you.
So I think the characters in my book, I don't want to speak for every single immigrant from India who's ever stepped foot on this country, but the characters in my book have come to Australia because they aspire to whiteness in some ways, and because they aspire to being of a higher, they aspire to a level of comfort that they don't find back home in India. And so in coming here, there are certain expectations that they have of themselves and of the culture into which they are inserting themselves. And those expectations have to do with being seen as an insider immediately, because of course they all speak English. And so if you speak English in Australia, of course you're going to be an insider, right? But as the characters in my stories find out, that doesn't quite happen as easily as they imagined. That the trajectory towards whiteness is blocked in many ways, and they have to subvert many forms of expectations and many forms of they have to negotiate this. The culture in which they have inserted themselves, that they thought they would be welcomed with open arms, but sadly and sometimes comically, this is not so.
I think in some ways the question really brings up this idea of, in some sense, how do migrants, how do they find space, make space within where it may not be obvious, where there is space, literally or metaphorically. And this is something that I've reflected a little bit on in some of the current writing that I'm in progress with, that looks a little bit at some of the kinds of migrant journeys that come from my family through very different cities. So my mother was born in Kambat in Gujarat, and her family since about the 1880s or so have been part of very, very transnational, mobile Indian communities that have taken them first leaving Gujarat and going out into Aden, and then eventually to Hong Kong. And so my family was part of the Indian community in Hong Kong, but with men going back to India and having families there and so forth. And I think in that situation, we think a little bit as well about how some of these these questions that arise about what does it mean to be moving as Indians into Hong Kong world, what are the ways in which both communities try to keep something that is distinctive and yet also to make common cause. And that was something that was very important to the way in which my mother would talk about her family. And she was part of the first generation to move as a young girl to come to Hong Kong, basically when the war, the Second World War was in progress. It was very difficult to go back and forth, and my grandmother was left on her own with lots of children and no money or husband coming back. And after the war, she said, enough is enough, we are all moving together. And so that was a generational change where I think we see in some ways, these tensions of both wanting to maintain something that was very specific to the particular cultural background they had, but also to be very open. My mother talks about her father inviting in people from different ethnic communities, different religious communities, having this really dynamic sense of trying to engage in those. And I think those are traditions that in some sense on the one hand are easier today in certain ways, but also ironically are more difficult. And oftentimes we see a hardening of kind of boundaries around different community lines, and those are kinds of questions that I think stay with us. And so as people from my family have moved on and gone into many other different cities, all Western cities, Australian cities, the US, all sorts of things, I think that those kinds of questions really go with them and have to be renegotiated and worked out about how do we want to stay connected and how do we want to make and forge new connections. And the ethical questions of that are often very complicated.
Yes, indeed. So how do you think your experience of growing up in urban spaces has had an impact on the way that you think about migration? Often migration is thought of as changing the social fabric of the existing place, and these kinds of communities that you talk about that were much more porous at one point of time, they seem to have changed now. Can you cast back growing up in this kind of a city, because the session is on immigrants in the city? So what is that specific connection with the city that allows for these kinds of proliferation of different communities coming together or not, and how has the shift happened?
I think in some ways the question of the city actually, and I'd like to maybe unpack a little bit in the sense that I feel like some of my experiences and the ones that have prompted my thinking have come from very different kinds of cities. And so some cities we think of are like Hong Kong, dense, urban density, that sense of, of really having everyone in that kind of physical proximity to each other. And cities like that have been important to me, and also the city of Mumbai, which is where many of my Indian relatives moved to, in a city that was one that, again, kind of shadowed my upbringing. But I lived in a small provincial city in the U.S. It was not a high-density city. You have to drive around everywhere to go places. It was a lot. It was a city in which you didn't necessarily have that kind of sense of high-density proximity. And it was also a city where there were a fair amount of real divisions along racial lines. the part of the world that I grew up in South Carolina, has a very strong African American community. The state's about 30% African American, but oftentimes the worlds would be either white worlds or black worlds, and relatively few kind of really multicultural or mixed, racially mixed or even diverse worlds. And my family was one of the very few families that didn't quite sit into that polarity. And so I think that in some ways, while cities can be places where we are forced to come together and interact and so forth, they can also be very much places that allow for separations, that allow and promote alternative pathways where you could be in the same city and yet never really part of the same community. And I think that's something about why and what are the factors that keep people apart are really important questions for us to think about in terms of how we are engaging with and moving through and shaping the urban spaces of today.
I think for the characters in my book, cities afford anonymity because they're huge and you can get lost in it and leave behind any literal and figurative excess baggage that you might have. But cities also afford the opportunity to shine and the opportunity to towards exceptionalism in many ways, which is what a lot of the characters in my book sometimes strive towards. One of the women in one of the stories is hoping that her child will be so successful, represent Australia in the swimming at the Olympics, and make her and her parents go viral. They want, that's the aspiration. We want our kids to succeed so that everyone will know that we are exceptional and we're these amazing Indian parents who've made it good in Australia. But some of the other characters find that the cities they're in, Sydney specifically, have all these layers that have not been addressed and not been negotiated, because these are not the stories of Indigenous the Indigenous custodianship of Australia, and is not part of the imagined story of Australia. It's not the story we're told and that we hear outside of Australia. Outside of Australia and India, we hear that Foster's is beer. We hear that everyone plays cricket on Bondi Beach, and things like that, cliches like that. That's what's. Those are the stories that help us imagine Australia from the outside. But when some of the characters come into Australia as immigrants, aspiring towards whiteness, and find in their rented backyard vestiges of Aboriginal middens, that's when that prompts an interrogation, however subtle it might be, into their own positions as immigrants on Indigenous land, on unceded Indigenous land. And for me, that is a really, really important part of being an outsider and moving towards being an insider. It's taken 21 years, and it's an ongoing process of trying to shed those stories that we were told about Australia in India and trying to reimagine Australia as unceded Indigenous land, and my position and the position of my characters as beneficiaries of that dispossession. And to me, that is an extremely crucial aspect of being an immigrant in a city that has been urbanized on the backs of dispossessed Indigenous people. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that responds to your question, but that's how the characters in my book think about. That's the trajectory along which they are proceeding towards negotiating a new place for themselves in Australia. Sometimes with tragic results, and sometimes with very comic repercussions.
So both of you are signaling towards the kinds of back histories or the stories or aspirations, perceptions that immigrants carry with themselves as they come into new spaces. So much of 20th century writing of the city played upon these remembered pasts. So you had people excavating their histories of what was back home. But in the 21st century, that scenario has shifted quite a bit. Increasingly, we hear of this apocalyptic vision of cities as collapsing under either the weight of immigrants or climate change is a big factor. And there has been a slew of programs recently. For example, in Australia, there's this program called Escape from the City, which promises beleaguered people from Sydney and Melbourne escaping to the countryside and finding an idyllic life. So that aspiration or those conditions or provisionalities that prompted an immigrant to move from one place to another may not be rewarded or achieved in the same way as what they thought. So I was wondering if both of you could think of what a 21st century writing of the city by a migrant or immigrant might look like. What comes to mind, coming from the positions that both of you have delineated? Yeah, absolutely. This might be, I invited both Shameem and Roanna to read from something that they have, if they felt that response suited the question.
So this is how I think the immigrants in the 21st century conceptualize the city and how they negotiate it. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'll tell you a story about telling a story. And it's from a story called The Skit in my book, The Permanent Resident. It's a November night in Sydney, and Paul and Rosalind, who are wealthy Indians, have invited some of their poorer Indian friends, who are Indian students, into their home, as they do on a Saturday evening. And they are waiting for Mr. Greenaway, John Greenaway, to arrive because he is Paul's client. Paul's an accountant, and John Greenaway is Paul's client, and they want to impress him because they want John Greenaway to fund their festival of Indian culture, social harmony, and business. So, so they're waiting for him to arrive while kind of making small talk with the other Indian students who are their friends from Bombay. Most of the Bombay gang were still on student visas, still drinking out of second-hand glasses from Vinnie's and eating off melamine plates while waiting and waiting for their applications for permanent residency to be processed. Lynette was one of them. She was Paul's neighbor from Bombay, now enrolled in an MBA at a university in Sydney. Paul and Rosalind were the lucky ones. They came to Sydney not as students, but on a secondment from Paul's multinational accounting firm. It was Rosalind who convinced Paul they should stay on, become Australian citizens, because it thrilled her to be anonymous yet striking in the undulating uniformity of Sydney's lower North Shore. In the background, Elvis was booming through Paul's new Bose speakers. You ain't nothing but a hound dog. Lisbert, an accounting student, had just stood up, stretched out his arms towards Lynette, about to ask her to jive. But when he heard Sushma's announcement, he retracted his arms and sat down again. Oh, said Paul, turning around. A skit? Because Sushma has just said that Lynette has written a skit and we want her to read it. So Paul says, a skit? You mean like a play? Didn't know we had a Salman Rushdie in Sydney. Salman Rushdie doesn't write plays, said Sanjay, another accounting student. Novels, he writes. Same thing, yaar, for any kind of writing, you have to have a good command of the language, said Paul. I always say, if you have the Queen's English, you have everything, said Rosalind. If you can write novels, you can write plays, said Paul. Salman Rushdie, if he tries to write plays, again he will make millions, again he will get a fatwa, again he will marry a model. But Polly, do you really think novels are the same as skits? Come on, let's hear it, said Sushma. She's written it, let's hear it. Lynette opened the embroidered cloth folder and lifted a few handwritten sheets of paper into the white light. Lisbert turned down the volume and turned on the yellow house lights. Lynette nodded ever so slightly without taking her eyes off a script. She began to read. It was a dark November night. Suddenly, Rosalind stood up. Lynette stopped reading. Rosalind said, "One sec, Lynette, I'll draw the curtains." When she was done, she sat down again and flicked her hand, indicating that Lynette could continue. So Lynette started again. This was the first time she had ever read her writing aloud to anyone, let alone to a whole group of people. She faltered at the start, her tongue tripping on the opening lines of dialogue. But soon she took the silence in the room for interest and was encouraged. The story was an amalgamation of many stories in the newspapers that year. A girl comes to Sydney on a student visa, attends a private college, and studies hairdressing. Like many others before her, she has been promised permanent residency in Australia, or PR, by her migration agent, by her private college, and by the man who stamped her visa. The fees are more than what was advertised in the brochure. When she complains to the student welfare officer, he is very sympathetic, invites her to his house, and after a glass of Riesling, begins to kiss her. She initially resists, like the good woman of Hindi films and convent schools, but he is cute and keen and accurate. She succumbs to the callings of her own body and his. In the throes of passion, however, he says, "Call me Mountbatten." Then eyes closed, he breathlessly proceeds to call her a stinking curry muncher cunt. She is stunned. She runs away immediately and decides to lodge a complaint of sexual assault and racism through the local courts. He contests the allegations, and playing on the latest cricket match-fixing scandals between India and Australia, he counter-alleges that she was attempting to buy him with sex. The story climaxes with a dramatic courtroom scene and ends with the girl being deported and the student welfare officer getting off scot-free. Lynette finished reading. There were brand new crystal glasses on the coffee table in front of Lynette. The light from the floor lamp made them glow like compliments. She asked, "So, was it okay?" There was silence. Then Rosalind said, "Oh my, that was, God, you poor thing. Why didn't you tell us you were going through all this?" Lynette had imagined all kinds of feedback. For weeks, she had practiced witty comebacks to questions about the dialogue, the sex scene in the story, the decision to reflect India through the broken mirrors of diasporic memory. But the assumption that the skit was autobiographical took her by surprise. No, I didn't go through any of this." Again, a silence, full of pity and a collective Catholic ache to be helpful. "Really, nothing like this happened to me, seriously. You mean to say you made it all up? What's it called, fiction or something?" "Yes," she said. "So it's not true then?" Rosalind got up and pulled the curtains back. "No." Sushma's eyes were red from the tears she was shedding freely. "Such a beautiful story. You are so brave. I mean, the girl is so brave. Poor thing." Lisbeth said, "Forget your MBA. You should take up writing. See J.K. Rowling? She's rolling in cash. What will your MBA give you? Nothing compared to that." Paul, who had not even taken one sip of his whiskey during the entire reading, now drained his glass and said, Lynette, who would have thought the little 2-year-old I saw running around in her panties in Barfiwala building in Baikala would one day write plays, like Salman Rushdie?" Sanjay inhaled sharply, but Paul ignored him and continued, "Superb. So proud of you, my girl. Didn't know that students who come here suffer like that. So terrible that she was deported." Sushma said, "Shit, yaar, what a heart-wrenching ending. Forget Hollywood. Forget Bollywood. This is heaps better. You can start an Aussiewood all by yourself." I'll end it there. It does get worse for the writer.
Thank you, Roanna. I think this Shameem, did you want to just pop in and respond to
Oh, I didn't know that. I guess just one thing I just want to maybe to pick up a little bit on of something that I think comes out so beautifully in that really wonderful scene that you just read is the importance of or attention. I think that maybe I could draw out here, because this is something that's quite important to me in what I work on, is the tension between the ways in which people can move around the world and can inhabit urban space, and the ways in which cultural practices can. And so that way in which I think that's figured with all of these individuals thinking about their immigration status, about their documents, and then thinking about Salman Rushdie's novels or hypothetical plays or so forth that have these abilities in some sense to cross in ways that are actually really different from the ways in which the characters can move around. And this is a tension that has been quite important to me in thinking a little bit about these asymmetries in some of the current questions that I look at. My project looks at the cultural politics of yoga, which is a cultural practice that's become very interesting to me because, for several reasons, partly because I think it is an increasingly an image of Indianness in the world and promoted through the state and through many other places as a kind of figure for a new sense of Indian identity, and yet also taken up in many other different ways. But here too, one of the kinds of historical tensions we have is that the periods in time when a cultural practice like yoga is moving around the world, coming oftentimes from India to different parts of the West, to Australia, and so forth, and being taken up and practiced by new kinds of communities, oftentimes simultaneously coincide with moments in which those societies are placing real limits on the way in which Indian people can come into those borders. So an example here would be something just from a U.S. context would be to say that, for much of the mid-20th century, Oriental exclusion laws are in place that, and they don't really end until 1965. There. So those kinds of very mixed histories about what can come into an urban space we think of the city as the cosmopolitan place where we can eat, food from so many countries and buy products from so many parts of the world, and we engage with experiences and so forth. And yet at the same time, and so it can be experienced culturally as this open, borderless seeming world, and yet it can also be experienced by migrants from precisely those parts of the world as something determined by these, what kind of visa do they have? What kinds of rights do they have? How are they situated in a much more precarious place? I think that tension is really something that we have to kind of hold and keep in mind as we think about the often asymmetrical paths that cultural practices and people might take in this process of migration.
Did you want to read from your work at the moment, or?
I can. Maybe I'll save it for a little bit. I think it might work a little later.
Listening to your story as well, Roanna, I was thinking of how the city has often been imagined as this space, as this unbounded space where the usually male flaneur can wander about, and the city is his to command. In terms of the relationship between immigration and writing the city, what space do you think? As women writers, as women theorists, what space do you think the city affords either of you or your characters in terms of imagining a space that the immigrant can occupy, especially in this era of Me Too, for example? What are the ways in which that older image of the city being the domain of the flaneur has been somehow turned on its head?
That term, the flaneur, I find quite interesting, to put it diplomatically, because I think you can be a flaneur if there's someone paying your bills. You can sit around and observe the world and write about it every day and night if your rent has been paid by someone else, or you're independently wealthy. So I think there's an element of class that comes into this term of the flaneur. And so as an immigrant, the reason why it's difficult for immigrants to be flaneurs is because there's that constant struggle to survive, really, and it's only when you have your food, clothing, shelter taken care of that you can move up that hierarchy and towards the self-actualized flaneur, maybe, on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But yeah, I find that I find it really difficult to deal with. I understand it, and I understand the whole history of so many writers who have who call themselves flaneurs even today. There are many people I know who have the word flaneur in their biographies, but it's not something that I am trying to come to terms with it.
But your characters too, they inhabit the city.
They inhabit the city, but it's an embodied inhabitation of the city where it's a constant grappling at the coalface of the city, rather than like a detached observer watching the world go by. That's what I think of when I think of the flaneur. Maybe I'm mistaken, but to me that term is highly, it's gendered, of course, but it's also raced and classed. Yeah.
Shameem?
I think in some ways the writing is a fantastic space where in some ways new kinds of ways of inhabiting cities that contest some of those can really start to emerge. And so, for example, you raised the question about women inhabiting city space and the kinds of particular sorts of safety, concerns that often are very real. I was certainly, a lot of my formative experiences as a young adult were spent in a city that is a wonderful, wonderful city. It is truly one of my favorite cities, but it is a city with a lot of urban problems. And, I lived there for many, in New Haven for many years, and this is a city in the U.S. and the U.S. Northeast, and it is extremely, you don't walk alone after dark. That is just simply not done. And so that sense of a constrained city about how one can expect to move around in it, I think is something that we find in many different parts of the world. And one of my very favorite responses to this has come through novels. Seeing there's one wonderful series that's set. It's by a fabulous writer, Shweta Taneja, and it's set in India, and she where again issues around women moving in public space have been very serious issues, and she creates this kind of urban fantasy in her work. It's these sort of tantrist mystery series that have a female detective who is this amazing kind of a figure who can fight all sorts of battles and all that. And she has written as an author about how important it was to create a female protagonist who could, in fiction, move through this sort of underworld of demons and monsters and slay them left and right and so forth in ways that she could not move in her own city. And so trying to imagine these sorts of new possibilities is I think, something that we can turn to fiction. At the same time, I also hope we're doing material things about making urban spaces better for everyone of different genders, different classes, different social identities to move within.
Different kinds of bodies move in the urban space in different ways, with a different sense of safety, a different sense of belonging. I wrote a fictional response to the attacks against Indian students that were happening for a variety of reasons a few years ago, mainly in the big cities, in Sydney and Melbourne. And in that story, Curry Muncher, it's the male kitchen hand who is attacked, while the female waitress, they're both Indian, the female waitress is not attacked physically, but also suffers the consequences of this attack, while also being complicit in some ways in that attack. And then the story is kind of, it's about her, the likening of herself to Pontius Pilate in some ways, washing her hands of this terrible thing that she has in some ways been complicit of in an urban space at a train station at night in Sydney. And so I think different kinds of bodies are read differently and are perceived differently with different levels of threat and different levels of acceptance, I think, in Australia.
We have 4 minutes left for the questions, and then we'll have Q&A. But I just want to quickly ask you, Both of you work in and on South Asia, and in an age when global cities of the South are being seen as challenging in every possible aspect of sustainability, human connection, whether rural-urban exodus becomes urgent and dire by the day. What role do you think writing plays in providing us with visions and realities of the subcontinental city? And both of you have a connection with Mumbai, but if there are other cities that you want to refer to. So can you think of subcontinental writers who have evocatively conjured up the city in our moment? And if you wanted to read something at this point of time, Shameem, I invite you to do so as well.
Maybe I'll just read a short piece here. The city, Mumbai, is it's a light touch, but it is quite important to me in some ways, in that I think very much of the city as a certain kind of condition of possibility for me, for how I have come to know certain things, and as both a point of return, an anchoring point, as well as a site from which there's a lot of dynamic mobility. So I'll just read a very short passage here from an essay called "The Yoga Mysteries." My uncle stands upside down in the living room. It's supposed to be good for his blood pressure. It's 1984, the year Indira Gandhi will be assassinated, 2 years after every textile worker walked out of the Bombay mills on strike. My uncle's factory makes batteries, not cloth. Still, it's not a good time to be running anything in this country. This is my first memory of yoga. As an 8-year-old with big glasses, I only saw my uncle's flushed face when he shook himself down and smoothed the rumpled white kurta he liked to wear around the flat. I only saw him balanced against the wall with his feet inches away from the ornate colonial couch. In Reagan's America, where I was growing up, nobody in my town did yoga. Yoga is getting very trendy in the West, I remarked to my uncle years later from the back seat of his Honda. As he aimed his car into the cauldron of what had then become Mumbai traffic, he scoffed. Trendy. Yoga is not a trend here. What is it exactly? What is it that I saw? We live in an age where yoga flourishes. At least it seems to. In India, you can practice in cold Himalayan ashrams, trendy studios, or mass drill yoga camps. In Iran, athletes gear up for official yoga competitions. Singapore studios offer downloadable yoga apps and classes where artists paint as they pose. Since the late 1990s, studios have become the new spiritual Starbucks. In the best sign that yoga has entered the globalized mainstream, you can buy yourself a Fuck Yoga t-shirt. And in the global march to conquer the world, yoga has started to invade our imagination. Spiritual autobiographies, comic novels, chick-lit romances, new histories, they pile up in crooked stacks on my desk, neatly ordered into grids on my iPad, making a strange bond between India and the world. The murder mysteries have turned out to be the best. When the murderer is an old Indian guru whose weapon is a fake Sanskrit text, or an American scholar of medieval ascetics with lethal occult power, you know that new stories are trying to be born. In these deaths, new and fantastical cultural life.
This might be a good time to open up the room to questions. So if we have the mics ready.
Hi, sorry, can everyone hear me? Thank you both for that. That was wonderful. I'm just wondering, immigrant writers writing in the city, whether you could talk a little bit about how you feel, whether it's possible to ever identify or ever to just be Australian, to not inhabit or embody that performative space, particularly that immigrant women, I think, inhabit, and just be Australian, or are you constantly having to navigate those identities that you've both spoken about? Or is that a constant part of, it's obvious through your writing, but just in everyday life as well? If you could talk a little bit about that. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. I think it's a really important question. And I think the response depends on who you ask. So if you've come here as, like I did in my early 20s, there's no way I can say I'm not Indian. I will always be Indian. That's where I was born. I was raised. I grew up. I went to school and university there, so I will always be Indian. The process of becoming Australian has taken a long time, legally, of course, but also to think of Australia as home has taken me a long time. I do consider it home now. I feel a sense of belonging. But for me, I claim that I am Indian and Australian. There's no way that me as an adult immigrant can say that I'm only Australian, because I'm not. But for people born here, that is a completely different question for them, because for them, Australia has always been home. They were born here. There is a particular sense of belonging that they have. And I think it's quite irksome and quite actually violent to ask people who were born here, if they are Australian or not. It's just quite, a lot of people find that quite insulting. And there's been a lot of right fiction that tries to negotiate that response, what does it mean to be Australian? So for someone like me, I am always Indian and Australian. I can't be otherwise. But for someone who was born here, it's a completely different response. Sorry, Amrita, I'm not sure if that...
I think it's also something that we can think about in some ways. I think one of the tensions that came out of what you said is that people who look a certain way or have family from a certain part of the world are seen as are you really Australian, and other people are seen as, oh, it's definitely Australian, even if they're both born here and so forth. And so one response in some ways is that because I think I'm similar to you, I feel like I'll always carry with me a lot of different strands in different places, and that complexity is always going to be there, and I want to embrace that. And I think that's something that actually people of all different sites can also embrace. That we don't need, that we can, the kinds of questions, we don't want to put them in a negative way on people who are born here by saying, are you sure you really belong? But if we ask them uniformly of everyone, of everyone here to think about, where is your family? As you were mentioning much earlier, everyone, with the exception of Indigenous groups here, has come in some kind of, relatively modern history. And so those kinds of thinking about the complexities of all of those journeys and bringing those in, I think is something that that can be a positive, part of the process as well.
I think it's about reimagining what we think of when we think of the term Australian. It's not just Foster's for beer. It's a lot of other things as well.
Again, this is, of course, related to the previous question a little. I've been here 20 years, and same as you, I feel, same as all of you, I guess, I feel both Indian and Australian. More Indian because I came here as a grown-up. Now, my daughter is born here, and we took her back for 3 years, trying to resettle, and then came back. And so there was a lot of angst, especially in me, because I have this constant one leg there and one leg here, mentally. And so how do we, the immigrants who are Trishanku, the mythical character who's hanging between heaven and hell, how does one ease that angst in ourselves, and one in the children? Like, you are a few generations out of India, and you still have so many strands of complexity. As a teenager, it's really hard traversing that path. How do we make it easier for them? As I know grown women of like 2-3 generations out of India, and they're still in a sort of in a clear space inside themselves.
I think For me, in some ways, the most, and this is still a question I ask myself, really, in many capacities, is I've really come to embrace anxieties as the sign of belonging. In some ways, that it is because I certainly, I was not born in India. I have that kind of, I think the ways in which the diaspora is always, sometimes seen as like, the generations where, they don't do things correctly and, don't have the cultural capital and so forth. And there's still many times when I wish I did, but I also have come to really in some ways positively embrace what might be the sites of anxiety or the gaps and so forth, and to kind of honor those as being signs of belonging. I feel sad that I don't speak my mother's mother tongue, Gujarati, which she did not pass on to me for a number of reasons, partly because of the context of the time. That was I was growing up in the U.S. and there was a lot of emphasis on, if your children learn multiple languages, they'll never be quite good at English, and that kind of thinking was very powerful. And I can't, my parents were making a choice they thought was best for me, and I can't fault them for that, even though I really wish, that had been part of my life. But I can in some sense say that my sense of that as a little bit of a loss is a powerful thing that I don't have about another language or another part of the world. Like it's too bad that I don't know Korean. That would be fantastic, but I don't. It doesn't. It's not an emotional site of anxiety for me in other ways. And so I think thinking about how even experiences that may not feel comfortable or positive, but in some sense it's the invisibility or the lacks or the ways that things are different can be understood in some ways as signs of belonging.
I guess I'm struggling with similar issues actually with my children who were born here. But for me, the sense of culture as being static, for me, it's a constant questioning of that because, for example, I want my children to have access to Indian culture, but what is Indian culture? It's completely changed since I was there last, and it's constantly changing, just as Australian culture is constantly in flux. So I guess I agree with you, that sense of anxiety being part of our subjectivity as immigrants, but also this sense of uncertainty and this sense of multiplicity, embracing that. And so what if they don't see themselves as Indian and just Australian? I think, what does it mean to be Australian? It means that you've got all of these other strands that are not recognized, and we need to keep talking about the differences and the diversity in Australian reality, which is not represented in Australian in the cultural imaginary as much as it is in real life. So I guess it's just a constant dialogue about diversity and about multiplicity to me.
We have only 1 minute left, and I might use this moment to quickly jump off those two questions and ask, this going back and forth assumes that one can. Because immigration to cities is not just about people who have the access of moving between spaces. So what does one do with that sense of this is it? How does someone negotiate that? Because there are issues of privilege associated with being able to go back or come back. What do we do with that? With that calling of oneself as Australian, does it come with certain kinds of riders that there might not be a possibility of going back? So you are Australian now, in that sense.
You don't have to be Australian. You can be someone who wants to go back but can't, I suppose, maybe. Is that, sorry, I didn't get the question.
Yeah, so then do you think that there are ways in which one conceives of oneself as Australian much more readily? That if those...
Because it's a convenience?
No, because I don't think human beings do things just out of convenience. I think there's also a sense of one charts one's lives according to the opportunities. And
of course, yeah.
So in that sense, that provisionality of Indian/Australian, Indian-Australian might be something, if the possibility of return is no longer there, if that is much more of an opening space for certain kinds of new national identities.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we can return in multiple ways. It's not just a physical return, but it can be an emotional return, a return through fiction, a return through art. And yes, while And yes, I definitely agree that it opens up new spaces to think about, to open up that idea of the nation state and its fixed boundaries, and to question the porosity of those boundaries that have always existed. Boundaries are new. Cultural boundaries have always been porous. And Australia has always been a multicultural continent. There have been over 300 indigenous groups in Australia that I'm sure traveled across the length and breadth of this continent, across the seas even. It's just that that's not the story we're told. And I think it's about being open to a multiplicity of stories. And as Claire Coleman said in the previous session, if all Australian history that you've read is a lie, just start reimagining history and start looking at new ways of looking at the past, which will completely change the way we think about the future.
I'm not sure I can add on to that. That is beautiful.
So let me thank the audience. We are at the end of our time. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm sure you can catch up with the writers outside. And will you be signing books? So, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So please join me in thanking Roanna and Shameem.
Thank you, Mridula, for being an excellent facilitator. And thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you.